And this is really exciting for us to introduce our next speaker, Greg Seltzer. Greg Seltzer as you see, is a North Carolina native. He also has a PhD in history from the University of Kentucky with a focus on French aviation. He is currently embarking in a second career, but he has taken some time out to go back to some of his expertise. We didn't give Greg much of a chance to rest because we already have worked with Greg at a wonderful program at Flyleaf Books, where he represented Carolina Public Humanities in a wonderful interview. Now I can't remember the name of the author, but you'll remind. Sam, that's right, Sam Wynn. But anyway, so as soon as we know that there is talent in the area, watch out. We're just going to grab a hold of you. So we are so excited for this. This is a talk where we're going to be going in the other direction. And in today's world where, I don't know, but aviation is just like we ended with the subway system about some of the challenges. All we hear about lately are long delays in airports and whatnot. So maybe we'll go back to the beginning and learn about commercial aviation, and then we'll leave it up to all of you to solve all the problems in the transportation systems in the United States after these talks. That's a tall order, isn't it, to open up a talk with? But please, without further ado, welcome Greg Seltzer, please.
Okay, well, I want to thank Max and everyone else with Carolina Public Humanities who is here. I know at least, Paul and this lady over here who lives with me. It's my wife. Anyway, my talk today is called From Sky High Hopes to Jet Lagged Folks, the Wright Brothers and the Takeoff of Modern Flight. And as you can already tell from my subtitle, we are going back to when flying, was a little bit before it was actually done in terms of powered fixed wing aircraft. And we're going to bring it to the modern day, going through not decade by decade, but still chronologically moving forward with an eye, though, on things that influenced flying in the early days and then what happened to that as time moved on. So I want to take a moment here before I get to the next slide to show you this image right here. This is a poster, and it was done by Joseph Binder for the 1939 New York City World's Fair. And what I like about this poster is it comes in, 1939, just before the beginning, well, technically, I guess the Second World War was, invasion of, Poland, I guess, I think, if I recall correctly, in the fall of 1939. But that was, Poland, not New York. So, with the New York City World's Fair, the theme was ascendancy, going up. What that represented, there was still a time, and this is one half of something that is very important with the early development of flight. Let's just say the first 60 years of so until the 1960s, let's just say, give or take, about flying and being, carried above, ascendancy. What do you get what do you see when you have the aerial perspective? You're able to see into the distance. You could look at that as a way to, metaphorically see into the future. You go up higher to see further. So this idea of flight and ascendancy, you can even see the little airplanes up here, the searchlights on the planes, the theme of ascendancy at the 1939 World's Fair. This was what fair organizers were trying to get across, not just with images from posters and fair programs, but also in a lot of some of the exhibits there. Around the fairgrounds, there was, various allegories of flight. There were winged figures, there were different ideas of aerial perspectives, imagining a world of tomorrow. So really the ascendant hopes, really, for the United States and also internationally. So this goes to one of those two important themes when flight was first developing, is that, there was ideas that it could be, magical in the positive way. It could unite people, weave together nations, create international links, like sky-high hopes, right? Exactly. Where can we go from here, especially in the United States, with this idea of moving forward and progress and looking towards the future, not dwelling in the past. So that is one aspect of that flying had in the first half, or let's say 60 years of the 20th century. And we will get to that other aspect, although it won't be primarily the focus of my presentation. So, for where we're going to go here, we're going to look at the sky-high hopes, and this is kind of how we're going to break it down. We're going to have, before the Wright brothers, you can read through this, feel free. We're going to go through all of it. This is our schedule for today, so I suppose that makes me the captain. And at the very end here, here's where I'm going to just highlight something. I know we have the question and answer, but I would like to take a few minutes at the end to just open the floor a little bit to ask you all a couple questions that we will get to related to flying. So, also want to make a few comments before we depart. So, if you talk about aviation generally, you could talk about a lot of things. I could stand here and we could start talking and we could be done at the end of the month, maybe, if we talked about everything. So I've made this very simple, what this presentation is and what it is not. So it is about commercial and or, civil aviation. It does go from the early 20th century primarily to the present. It does focus on the United States. There are a whole host of things I could talk about, but I'm going to talk about specific turning points, and you will see that in the way it is broken down with the different eras and the different sections. I'm going to focus primarily on people and the passenger experience, people flying on the planes. And I'm also going to focus a lot on symbolism, what flying meant to people at the time, what it represented, much like with the 1939 fair, the idea of ascendancy. While military aviation was very important, and it was often, this is the case with the First and the Second World War, developments either spurred by war or that were utilized during the war with each war with regard to military aviation, fostered developments in flight technology after the war. Sometimes developments made during the war were put into what, let's say commercial air travel after the war. This was common. However, my topic is not, or my presentation is not really going to focus on it that much. Yes, there will be specific information about certain pilots, but this presentation isn't going to get every significant pilot or pilots of note. I also want to acknowledge that it's unfortunate, and we will see this with the case of air travel. I'm not going to be able to, I'm not saying because, I'm not really talking about, someone who, prominent pilot like Amelia Earhart or the Tuskegee Airmen or people like that their achievements didn't matter and weren't significant. It kind of reflects kind of the tide of the times and the social organization in the United States, the socioeconomic structure that, the main people that are going to be discussed and shown in images related to plane advertising are, of course, just going to be white people, because that's just how the situation was for the majority, or let's just say the first 60 or so years of the 20th century. I'm also not really going to focus on mail and cargo transportation, although, again, interestingly, especially in the early years, it was mail and cargo transportation that really paid the bills for nascent airlines, or if it wasn't just going to be financed, the federal government was financing aviation companies to fly mail and cargo. Passengers were just more of a secondary concern for quite a while. And even with the technical details of flying, I'm not really going to get into this as much. You might say, well, Greg likes flying. You must really like, maybe he has a pilot's license. I don't like flying. It's more like the symbolism, like I said. I find that fascinating. I don't find flying fascinating itself, which is also interesting when you think about it, because this is just something to just kind of keep in your mind when you think about flying today. Have you gotten on an airplane recently? And let's say you're up in the clouds and you were looking down and you were like, this is just awe-inspiring that I am this high above the ground. Maybe sometimes, but was that really what was the primary focus? Did it seem like, as certain pilots said during the First World War, this was like the most magical thing that I could ever do, was be this high above the ground? He said, this one pilot named Cecil Lewis said, there is nothing like flying, there never could be. This was it for him. This experience of being this high above the ground was just, it was stunning. And he was one of the few individuals at that time, he wrote this in, let's say 1915, 1916, that, one of the few individuals that were being able to do this. So, personally, again, I don't look down and think, this is amazing. I look down and think, I'd really like to land soon. So that's kind of just, just kind of something to just keep in mind. So it's not going to be a bunch of, I keep on doing that, a bunch of technical details about flying. Let me just see if I can move this around without, I'm just going to move this to the other side real quick. Maybe that will make it easier. Okay. Okay, so it is not letting me do what I want to do. Okay, so I do have this image. I said I wasn't really going to talk about anything with individual pilots or air races, but this was a program for an air race or an air rally or one of these events where people would fly, usually for a prize, to see who could make it between 2 points quickest. And these were done, with some frequency in the 1920s. To give you an idea of some of the symbolism that was associated with flying in this early period of time, we see this, this goddess. Of course, we see, USA on the side of the plane, and we see this goddess just sort of holding the plane aloft, and just thrusting it, further away. So it's really the something, let's just say some sort of deity, actually making contact with humanity, this divine force throwing the plane or releasing it or sending it on its way, or maybe she's actually further back and just, screaming goodbye to it. But either way, you see that connection that people made between flying and the divine at this time, that it was a magical experience. There was some sort of mythical aura to being able to fly in these first decades of the 20th century. So, before the Wright brothers, as we continue going on, we have balloons and the stuff of dreams and nightmares. So this is looking back, just briefly touching on what was going on prior to the Wright brothers. Because before flying was actually developed as a technology, people had already formed an idea of what they thought it would or could do. Because thinking about human beings, being carried aloft, it seemed like, there was so much potential. People weren't sure what flying would do or could do, so they imagined both, like the image at the beginning from the fair, they imagined, maybe a utopian future. We'll be carried away into this distance of a peaceful, interconnected world. Or, the other side of this is maybe flying, it carries this destructive potential. People imagine, writers, let's just say H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, late 19th century, were imagining, a war in the air where aircraft would, of course, bomb cities, completely destroy cities. You have to remember that this period in the, as we move through the 19th century, the tensions in Europe start to ratchet up, ultimately, eventually leading to the First World War. But this idea, what Peter Fritzsche is saying in A Nation of Flyers is that the air age was both fabulous and horrible. He's writing primarily about the interwar years, that's the 20s and 30s. This is still a period where people really weren't sure what this new technology, the newest of technologies, and it was so powerful, and it had so much potential, people still weren't really sure what ultimately the purpose was going to be. Was it going to be good or bad? Was it going to destroy or connect? Was it going to unite or divide? Was it going to make people, was it going to bring about, more, level the playing field, so to speak, or was it just going to create more of an imbalance of power? So it was very, even into the, let's just say first half of the 20th century, when it was sort of defined by, this was not as much a question by the Second World War, but there was a time, going back to these fiction writers of the think about the 19th century, these ideas of what flying could or would do, and of course mythology. Every people knows about Icarus, or going back to someone like Da Vinci and imagining flying, flying machines, people thinking about these different things, even though someone didn't specifically come up with a design that looked exactly like, the Wright flyer, people still thought a lot about this. So the, flight had sort of been, or airplanes or flying machines had been sort of drafted in people's minds or on paper before they flew in actuality. This image here shows a early ballooning adventure in Paris, and this was, you could say, kind of a precursor to flying in a way. We're not going to talk. I'm not going to, discuss, let's say dirigibles, like, rigid aircraft, like actually discussed with S.E. Gwynn, or, a craft like the Hindenburg, or R101, which was what his book was about. But we're not going to talk about, ballooning in that sense, like Zeppelins and whatnot. But this idea, or, actual like hot air balloons in 18th century France, the French had launched the first one in August 1783. It was at the Champ de Mars in Paris. It was developed by Jacques Charles. And what I think is kind of funny about this, and this area will come into play later in this presentation, it traveled for less than an hour, this red and yellow silk balloon filled with hydrogen. It was unmanned. It came down in Gonesse, about an hour outside of Paris. And this was in 1783, of course, and residents there, these peasants, had no idea what this was when it started to come down. Thinking it was a monster, they, of course, slayed the monster with pitchforks and knives, and, I guess, Jacques Charles would have just come and collected his, balloon on a wagon or something after that, because I think that was all that was left of it. So we certainly have some precursors for flying here prior to the Wright brothers. And the important thing, I think, to keep in mind is that flying, again, had this potential for being both destructive or being able to unite people. There was a lot of potential for connection or destruction. And it carried this dual meaning for the first half of the 20th century. All right, why am I? Whoops. I'm trying to move down on. Yes, I have on the, I had some more things on the notes page here, but I'm not able to like scroll down without switching the slides, and I'm not really sure. And I'm not seeing like my mouse come up when okay, why is I not, I can't, here it is, there it goes. That's why I can't see it. I wasn't looking in the right place. Okay, all right. Well, that is certainly helpful. So anyway, there was a lot of these, associations with flying, that it could be, one or the other. And indeed, often it was both, as we will see. So, 1903 to 1914, our first period of time. And as you can see, of course, 1903 is when the Wright brothers had their inaugural flight. And 1914, of course, is the start of the First World War. So now this is our first chunk of time for powered flight. And as you can see from this quote from Bill Morris, when he's talking about in this book all these developments in the Age of Astonishment, he says, man now owned the heavens, which he was applying to the Wright brothers being able to fly. So everyone knows this story, of course. On December 17th, 1903, the Wright brothers, that's Orville and Wilbur Wright, inaugurated the aerial age with their first successful flight in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The Wright brothers, of course, originally from Ohio, and it seems like this is a point of contention between the state of Ohio and here in North Carolina. And, I suppose I would, of course, I'm going to favor North Carolina here because they actually came to North Carolina. They'd consulted the Weather Bureau about where would be a good place to test out their flyer because there were no suitable locations in Ohio. So they came to the Outer Banks of North Carolina and made a small fishing hamlet quite popular. So I would probably say if this really like the birthplace of flight, I don't know, like maybe Ohio's the birthplace of the people who went somewhere else to invent flying. I don't really know. But in any case, in fact, of course, if you know anything about the Wright brothers, they were very diligent and focused. And they didn't just develop over a period of time, like very careful research into the mechanics of flying. They did even the motor, the small horse, I forget what it was, maybe like 12 horsepower. It might have been engine that they had for their little Wright flyer here. It was, that in and of itself was such an innovative design. Everything they did, they built the first in Kitty Hawk a small wind tunnel to take measurements for different aerodynamic and lift forces. They made all these like just calculations, and personally they did all this great work, and that's awesome. It's hard to find. I don't know if they really had any sort of like intrigue or scandal in their lives, which is great. I mean, they did they did a lot of extremely important work for this early period of time. And not only did they achieve this breakthrough with, having the first powered flight, they also, equally important, like I said, is just having really the foundation of aeronautical engineering during this time. So their flight and all the work they did in the years leading up to it, but from like the late 1890s to 1903 was extremely important. And, as kids, they just had really just a passing interest in flying. And it wasn't till the crash and subsequent death of a famous glider pilot that, the Wright brothers became interested in aviation. They had written to, very much like they do, it seems like, with their hard work and their diligence, written to the Smithsonian asking, we need do you have any information on anything with flight? And the Smithsonian sent them a bunch of information or how to access it. And from there, they just, let's say, took off, pardon the metaphor. And over the course from 1899 to 1903, they built and refined various versions of gliders and small, versions that didn't work as well of flyers that were powered. And they dealt with a variety of issues, whether it was control, how to properly steer the plane, the efficient shape for an airfoil, or other structural design problems, which they continued to work and tinker with over the year. They essentially when they were in Kitty Hawk, they made an unsuccessful attempt at flying on December 14th, which slightly damaged their flyer, which you can see here on the images in the screen. I believe they did modify it soon hereafter. Of course, you can see as it was laying down the one of the Wright brothers laying down here, they did eventually have a seat in there, a chair where you were able to sit in it and be able to fly. Of course, as you can see, it doesn't have any wheels. It was on a rail that was pulled, and then it was able to take off from there. I don't know if anyone's been out to Kitty Hawk and seen the facilities they have out there. It really wasn't a whole lot. You know, they have the rail, and they have a replica of a shed, and the monument is, you know, understandably, it is huge compared to like what the actual like flying facility or what the landscape looked like at the time for flying, but very much like they were looking for. It was there was, you know, sand and you know, hills. If you've ever been out there, they have huge like Jockey's Ridge out on the Outer Banks. It's just huge sand dunes with plenty of wind. It was the ideal location. I don't think they could have found that many perfect sand dunes and all that wind in Dayton, Ohio. I'm not familiar with the geography then, but I am somewhat a little bit familiar with it now, and I can't imagine it's changed that much unless I missed something. So they basically just flipped a coin to see who would fly first. So it was Orville ended up winning. So it lifted off for a flight. I would probably like the length of this. It was 12 seconds, and it traveled to 120 feet. That's, you know, my type of that's my type of trip. And subsequently, they made 3 more flights that morning, and they were alternating as pilots. And the second and third were in the range of 200 feet, while the fourth and last one covered 852 feet in 59 seconds. So they were making, you know, even substantial progress in this short amount of time from this short flight. This first one that was only 12 seconds long. So unfortunately, as the brothers and some other people who were present just were discussing what had just happened, a gust of wind overturned the Wright Flyer and sent it tumbling across the sand, and the aircraft was severely damaged and never flown again. So it had a very short existence. Didn't have a lot of miles on it. But nonetheless, it successfully demonstrated their design for a heavier than air flying machine. They built other versions in 1904 and 1905, refining their design and bringing it into more practical use. Of course, other people were following this. Even though they did it in this isolated, like I said, little fishing hamlet of Kitty Hawk, you know, this certainly made a lot of news and because a lot of people, they weren't, of course, the only people working on this. I brought up the French, for example. There were people like looking into who could be the first to fly. It's not like the Wright brothers didn't just, you know, stumble on something that no one had really thought about, because of course, like I said, people have been thinking about this for hundreds, if not thousands of years, on exactly what humans could do to be able to achieve powered flight. The airplane was, of course, as you can see, in the Smithsonian. It was formally donated in mid-December 1948, and it has been there ever since. After the original one was destroyed, it was crated up and sent back to the Wright brothers' home in Ohio, where it was subsequently stuffed in a basement, damaged in a flood, uncrated, I don't know, 13 or so years later, and finally put back together and given to the Smithsonian. So, moving on a little bit from after, as I said, the Wright brothers had flown, there were a lot of other attempts. People continued to make progress leading up to the Second World War. The image I have here is a Frenchman, Louis Blériot. I used to, when I did more history, my French used to be a lot better. You've seen how much it's degraded. He, on 25th or 25, July 25th, I'm not really sure why I wrote it like that on there, 1909, he departed to cross the English Channel. So keep in mind that this is, what, approximately 6 years, less than 6 years after the Wright brothers flew. And the technology that he has, he was able to cross the English Channel. If you look at how much more developed his plane looks compared to the Wright Brothers plane, you see how much people were invested in this, because when the Wright Brothers were flying, they achieved something that mattered a lot to people, not just in terms of their imaginations and culture, but also, again, going back to what they could see being done and the potential for flying to achieve both, let's say, peaceful and destructive ends. People, recognize this. Like, airplanes were first used to bomb populations in. I'm trying to think which war it was. It was, I believe it was in the Middle East. It was one of maybe France. Can't remember if it's France, but this was in 1911. This was only 2 years after that. They're already using it to, bomb. People were already using aircraft to try for part of this destructive potential. So when Louis Blériot took off on July 25th, 1909, he completed this first successful flight across the channel in approximately 35 minutes. I have no idea how long it would take to fly across the English Channel now. I imagine it was significantly shorter than 35 minutes. So this was another significant achievement, and I'm pointing it out because, again, it really shows that aircraft technology, these achievements were happening with some speed once the Wright brothers achieved powered flight. Moving on to the next period here, we have 1914 to 1927. So we're not really going to talk about what's going on during the First World War, except to say that the potential for aircraft was really proven with the First World War, not only like improving the technology of flying, but also, especially, like I said, the military use of aircraft, using it to, bomb, strafe, or even the idea of, the flying ace, the night of the sky, that fulfilled this desire that people had to see some sort of semblance of individualism and honor, and something that wasn't faceless mass slaughter in the dirty trenches below. So this was another way that in the First World War that the really the hunger for some sort of cultural significance for flying was fulfilled through even seeing the individual aces. So after the First World War, there were plenty of pilots, since there was no longer any war, with they were out of the job, and there were companies, so much had been developed, aircraft had been comparatively speaking kind of mass developed during the First World War. France had the most airplanes following the war, and they had over 4,000. So it wasn't like the aircraft industry, while still nascent at the time around the globe, there's kind of a reservoir of pilots and planes, again, comparatively speaking, with nothing to do after the First World War. So this really set the stage for the development of passenger travel. So when we think about early days of commercial flying, actually, before I get to that, I think I should mention this guy named Charles Lindbergh here. So, of course, moving to the very end of this era, Lindbergh, excuse me, let me think, it was, I think when this was started exactly. Actually, I'm going to just, in the interest of time, I'm going to, before I get into the whole Lindbergh spiel, I will talk about just briefly these early days of commercial flying. So, unlike today, flying, though it had this mystique about it, was harsh and uncomfortable. And to even be able to fly was a luxury. Very few people did, very few. And often when they flew, I said it was uncomfortable. They would often have to just sit on, whatever space was available in an aircraft that was carrying mail. They might just sit on a bag of mail, and that's it. And it was still expensive. So this astronomical cost was you know, it was something like $260 in 1934, for example. This would be something like, I was trying to think of figure like I had this calculated like 9,000 today or 5,000, something like that, to sit, you know, in an uncomfortable plane. A little bit better than a bag of mail by this point, but you still weren't really in anything except for, let's just say, an unpressurized aircraft at low altitudes. You know, oftentimes in the early days, they were in open cockpits, fully exposed to the cold, wind, and weather. And of course, the lower the altitude you fly, the more likely you will experience a lot of turbulence. And, you know, considering, as I said, the aircraft weren't pressurized in this early era, they were forced to fly at lower altitudes in aircraft that didn't have as much power. So if you can imagine how fun that would be, I would not be first in line to shell out thousands of dollars to do that. And again, as I said, in these early days, sometimes planes could, you know, if you think of like a typical World War I plane, you can only carry maybe 1, 2 passengers. So you really don't have a lot of people to reach out to if you're you know, to kind of share your sorrow with if you're the only one on the plane with the pilot. And as I mentioned earlier, to even sniff any profits, airlines in this era had to, you know, make most of their money on mail transport for the government. So, you know, you could ask, what was the appeal? Was it the novelty, the speed, you know, that you were doing something new that no one else or very few people were being able to do. And this was a relatively new technology still. And I look at this and I kind of wonder if what could be the comparison today for being able to do something like this in this era. I don't know if it would be like, you know, with the people taking like, you know, like rockets into space or being on, what are they, you know, it was like $250,000 to fly into space for a little bit. It seems like, I don't know, that seems like the closest equivalent. And again, it sometimes is difficult for me to put myself in the mindset of someone during this period of time, because flying is so common today. You know, everyone does it. It's just, you know, it's just how you get from here to there very quickly. It's not about really the experience itself. As you can see from this quote from Modris Exthenes, the most significant technological achievement of the modern world. And of course, he's talking about flying as shown, like I said, by the end of the First World War. So, getting back to this guy named Lindbergh. In May 1919, a Frenchman named Raymond Ortigue put up a purse of $25,000 for the first aviator or aviators to fly nonstop from Paris to New York or New York to Paris. So Charles Lindbergh, who had some experience as a barnstorming pilot prior to this period of time, he convinced the St. Louis Chamber of Commerce to sponsor his flight. And of course, he named it after the spirit of St. Louis for the generosity of the city for giving him this donation. And he took a Ryan Air airplane and made a lot of modification, added extra fuel tanks. You can see it wasn't actually, this is just Pima cotton over wood. It wasn't metal. It might look metal, but it was painted this color. It's not, I, for the longest time, might have thought it was a metal aircraft, but it is relatively fragile. And he added extra fuel tanks. He also added throughout a lot of the wingspan of the original aircraft was also increased. And the main fuel tank was placed in front of the cockpit because it would be the safest there in front of a crash. So as you can see, I don't know if you've noticed this before, there's no front window here. He had a little periscope where he could see out the top. And the way he was able to he had a sense of, he kept at a certain altitude, but to get a sense of where he was flying, he would sort of do what some rigid balloons would do. He would sort of fly in a crabbing motion so we could see out this side window here when he was flying if he needed to get some bearings on where he was going. But of course, since he was flying over the open ocean with no markers, it probably wouldn't have made much of a difference. So getting back to the flight itself, so I said he had no forward vision, and to reduce weight, everything that was not utterly essential was tossed out. There would be no radio, no gas gauge. There would be no night flying lights or no parachute or anything or any sort of navigation equipment, really. So he was just like, well, I guess we'll take off and see how this goes. And Lindbergh was a pretty tall guy, so he was kind of folded and stuffed in there. And he sat on a seat made of wicker. And unlike other aviators who attempted, he flew by himself. This wasn't anything he was going to do with anyone else. So on May 20th, 1927 at 7:52 a.m., he took off from Roosevelt Field in New York, and it was so loaded with fuel that it barely cleared the telephone wires at the end of the runway. And he, of course, continued to go on. I'm not going to go into depth about every step of his flight because a lot of it was just flying and trying to stay awake. He eventually, of course, struggling to stay awake, and this was at 10:22 p.m. Local time. So this would have been, I guess, thinking how this would have worked, this would have been, I guess, so it would have been like this the next day then, right? Yes, because he flew for 33 hours without any rest. So he'd been awake for this entire time flying this plane. I suppose if anything's going to keep you awake, I guess it could be the thought that if you happen to nod off, there's a 100% chance you're going to crash. So we traveled to Le Bourget Airport outside of Paris, and by this time, tens of thousands of people had gathered to await Lindbergh's arrival. And he actually hadn't slept, because I'd forgotten this. He hadn't slept the night before very well, and he'd been up for something like 55 hours straight at this point. And there was such a crowd. This is interesting. This isn't actually his plane landing at Le Bourget. This was taken several days later when he landed at Croydon Airport. Is that outside of London, I believe? I'm trying to think, or it's somewhere around. I know it's in England. So he landed there, and his plane was torn to, they had to move him out of there and his plane because it was getting torn apart by this just frenzy, this mob of people. But there was a huge crowd that surrounded him, tens of thousands of people at the airport. And he, was actually not a lot of real pictures taken because he arrived so late at night, they weren't able to photograph him effectively. This picture here is him with this crowd in front of him, or actually behind him, getting ready to take off from Roosevelt Field. So this was, of course, an extremely significant event. The first transatlantic crossing in an aircraft. And there was really like a mania for this at the time. So we will need to speed up a little bit, as I see, and we will continue moving forward. Okay, so 1927 to 1941. As I had mentioned, the cost of flying was very expensive at the time. That figure actually for flying in 1934 would be $5,931.32 for that type of flight. That is, this would be for a coast-to-coast round-trip flight in the era, which you have to remember would have taken a long time to do, just flying from one coast to the other in and of itself. Not a short amount of time today, much longer then. So boosted by Lindbergh's flight especially, the public interest in flying dramatically increased during the 1920s and 30s. And after the First World War, certainly magnified by Lindbergh, this was really what one historian called a subject of popular curiosity verging on the obsessive. So despite the the high cost of it, people were fascinated by this, but still very few people were flying at this time. As you can see, it was exclusive, it was uncomfortable, and it was very expensive. And again, people were still considering at this point, up through this point, whether flying would have this, more, because this is before the Second World War, whether it would ultimately be more destructive, or if it would connect people. You got to think in the 30s, in the mid to late 1930s, we have the Spanish Civil War. You've seen that picture, after the bombing of Guernica, and the Picasso picture, the painting. You get a sense of, this destructive potential still held on in people's imaginations. And as you can see here in this image with Pan American Airways, one of the premier American airlines from the late 20s up until 1991, actually. And as you can see, this almost kind of captures some of this dual thinking with aircraft, because of course Pan Am developed as a commercial airliner as we get close to, or even in, the beginning of World War I. You see, it's not just about Pan Am being able to carry people, it's of course about what it means for, literally, as you can see with these images, being a marker of the United States, carrying the American flag to all these distant areas, keeping it secure. Of course, you can see makes sense now, not much headway into Europe right here. There could be some issues there in the 40s, especially in the early 1940s from where this image is from. But you can see, what this really shows is that, it wasn't just with the development of aviation, it wasn't just, even with peaceful intent, the United States, this is really shown and highlighted by Pan Am itself, was carrying, national interests internationally. It was certainly taking along with it, not just, opening up lines of communication, but also moving and spreading American influence in a way that wasn't as overtly exploitative and destructive as colonial powers. Of course, I studied France and Indochina and aviation, so I can certainly tell you a lot about that. And as you can see here, the Douglas DC-3, which was introduced in 1936, became a very popular commercial aircraft during this era. And to get a little bit back to the part about being uncomfortable, this is the inside of a Ford tri-motor aircraft from, this is probably earlier, or this would be, let's say earlier, not probably early 30s. And this was known as the Tin Goose, this aircraft, which isn't really, I wouldn't want to have that nickname. As you can see, it has actually, right here in this image, it says you can see TWA. This was a promotional image, probably to show how nice flying could seem. What it doesn't show is the of course, the noise, and it's uncomfortable, and people getting sick, and all those things. But that wouldn't be a way to sell tickets. TWA was formed in, starts flying in 1930. So this would have been it was formed by a merger of two other smaller airlines. So this would have been when that image would have to be. But here's kind of what you're dealing with: 8 or 9 passengers, a smaller aircraft. This is what early passenger travel was like. And this was really the world's first luxury airliner, if you can believe it. And it really was what helped commercial air travel take off. And despite, you could say, these people don't look very happy, but this is supposed to be cheerful advertising. It really was uncomfortable. And what I found really interesting about this was that, one way to make up for this and to ease discomfort was to offer a whole bunch of amenities. Try to do, what you can. Oddly, one of these amenities was having women on board as flight attendants, because what could bring you more comfort than a woman who used to be a nurse? And if she is, brave enough to fly, this really shows the gender roles at the time and the culture. If a woman is brave enough to fly and it's safe enough for her to fly on a plane, then it sure is safe enough for any old businessman to do the same. So again, it was mostly people flying at this time were people who were, extremely wealthy, and, business travelers, anyone, making, that type of money to be able to pay that much for a ticket at the time. But even so, even despite the discomforts and high price, each year aviation saw a continuous increase in the number of people flying, thousands of new passengers each year. As an example, there were only 6,000 passengers in 1929. This jumped to over 450,000 in 1934. But at the same time, it was still only a small number of people flying, since some of these people might have been flying more than one time. And many of the flights were on very short routes also. And there were, quite a few little airlines. Many of them didn't last very long because it was a hard business to be in. I think this is interesting. As a concrete example of how loud it was on one of these aircraft, a Ford tri-motor engine with all the engines going, so that's tri-motor, that's, I'm not very good at math, but that sounds like 3 to me. The noise at takeoff was nearly 120 decibels, which was loud enough to cause, some hearing issues over the long term. And the cabin crew often had to resort to using small megaphones to communicate with passengers amidst all this noise in the cabin. And I had mentioned it's 120 decibels. The threshold for actual pain from such a loud noise is 130 decibels. And if you're up to 160, that can cause instant perforation of the eardrum. So it certainly was loud. I would probably take a crying infant over, something that is on the threshold of pain. But this is what traveling by air was like at the during these early years. After the Second World War, flying continued to expand and planes continued to get faster. One of the best examples of what progress made during this time was the development eventually we will get to that just next. Sorry, I was getting ahead of myself trying to think of the time. So this double-decker Pan Am Super Stratocoaster shown right here is the world's largest and most comfortable airline. This advertisement was from 1957. What's really interesting about this is that this aircraft was modeled on a Stratocruiser airplane, which was introduced in the late 40s, was developed itself. So there was a line here from the Stratocruiser, which was the Pan Am plane, which was developed from the Stratofreighter used during World War II, which was a descendant of the B-29 Super Fortress, which was the long-range heavy bomber, 2 modified versions of which were used to drop the 2 atomic bombs in Japan to end the Second World War. So from that lineage came this very large commercial airliner. And it was certainly important in terms of carrying more people, because more people were wanting to fly. In 1955, actually, for the first time, more people in the United States traveled by air than by train. By 1957, airlines had actually replaced ocean liners as a preferred means of crossing the Atlantic. And as I'm sort of getting at, after World War II, passenger air travel surged to a whole new level, especially, with the indicating the era of mass travel. Some people, of course, were conspicuously absent. As I mentioned earlier, if you look at a lot of these advertisements, primarily the people you're going to be seeing are, many, white people, not, and this was true. This was reflected. What you're seeing in these images is what you got at the time. And, again, that's just an unfortunate reality of the times, but it was certainly reality. And you would get a lot of, the passengers were shown they would be treated very well. Like, this is a menu here for United Airlines from Cleveland. Look what you get. You get hot consomme crackers, beef tenderloin tips. This is unimaginable now. I remember flying from Charlotte to St. Louis as a kid on an hour-and-a-half flight, and I was delighted to get like a free, box lunch with a sandwich and chips and a dessert, and I got the whole can of soda, not just half of it. And, certainly, but this was like, look at all the fun stuff you get. You get all these things, talking about the amenities you would get at the time, because, while flying was increasing in popularity, it was still, somewhat expensive, and this was before the era of deregulation, which we will get to very directly. From this period of 1958 to 1979, this is when we get into the jet age. And right here you can see the cabin of a Boeing 707 jetliner. As you can see, we're getting higher, so we have pressurized cabins. And more people, again, continuing this trend, more people continuing to take flight. For some of the images you see, again, you can see some of what it's really reflecting about popular culture at the time. Like, this guy, Pan Am, you're flying on it with him. This is certainly a very well-to-do business guy is, doing business here. And then, of course, his, just typical standard housewife, you'd think of the era, is just pleased to serve him coffee right when he gets back so he can just continue. It looks like he's almost not even moving, sitting in the same position, being able to just go from, home to work to back. And then this is funny. It says, don't leave your husband, sneak up on him, tussle his hair, take him to, Morocco, take him to the Casbah, this idea of sort of going to some distant part of the world, again, sort of fantasizing this idea of the Orient and the other, and, how the U.S. could expand and just people could see these foreign lands kind of, so to speak, as just their areas to kind of go and explore. Again, just they're just areas just that there was in an effort to commercialize and sort of make air travel really about like going on vacation, being elsewhere, so to speak. So like I said, the Boeing 707 was introduced in the fall of 1958. It wasn't the first jetliner, but it was widely used and is often credited with starting the jet age, which means flying a lot faster, being able to go further, and also being able to fly with, probably the stewardess and or the flight crew not having to use a megaphone anymore. This is just some more about like this era, and don't think I'll get to this. I'll move a little bit further because I have a little bit more to go. I got a little bit behind here, but as you can see, just specifically, again, with Pan Am talking about different ways to expand air travel, not just having like a first class, but having, it looks like a first class, business class, economy. I just look at those seats and I'm like, is there room between the seats? That's hard to imagine now, But again, just thinking about like during this era, the number of people continue to expand who are flying. So I don't know if any of you may or may not remember the development or the actual flying of the Concorde aircraft. This is a supersonic aircraft, which means going faster than the speed of sound. This is really important, I think, as a marker for what it represented in terms of continuing to go faster and really almost looking back and reflecting these early days of flying, because it was a small aircraft on the inside. Like, see, maybe 100 people. As you can see, this is like the seating arrangement. And it was really interesting because they had this little thing. You can see it at the front, at the on the bulkhead right here. You can see, how fast the plane is going. So, and it would fly really high to, like 54,000 feet. What do they fly at now? 35,000, something like that. So this idea of flying like in, relatively speaking, a somewhat cramped interior space, paying an extremely high price and being part of an exclusive club to be able to do this. And as a quick mention here, in 2000, a one-way ticket on Concorde from New York to Paris or London started at $9,150, which would cost, get ready, $16,243.16 today. But by doing this, you could fly between New York to Paris or London in under 3.5 hours, which is much quicker than you can get to there today. We probably have to, let's see. Just continuing briefly here. So in 1979, we have deregulation, which was essentially when, let's see, I'm just sort of trying to see. Okay, so the Civil Aeronautics Board, which had regulated many things with flying in terms of the price of tickets, which, with prices being regulated, it really limited the number of airlines that could travel. If smaller airlines would try to get into markets, the government would dictate, what ticket prices would be, who was flying what routes. But when deregulation was passed as law in 1979, this really opened the market to other airlines. And at this point, to keep making money, airlines started cutting out all these amenities because low-cost carriers, companies like Southwest that had been established in 1971, they were able to cut in these budget airlines that couldn't make inroads into the market. They were able to, start to establish routes, start cutting out everything. If you've flown on a Southwest plane, I've only done it a couple times, but you don't get a whole lot of stuff, or I don't really know if you get anything without having to, pay extra, but people will do that though. And of course, dropping comparatively the price of tickets. So a lot of these larger, kind of I can forget the word here, but these airlines that have been in place, like Pan Am, they struggled to keep up because they had been, overextended, and it wasn't just deregulation. It was also, there was a airport workers strike, and there was also, like the oil crisis. A lot of these things were affecting, and the economic recession of the 1980s, these were hurting these airlines that had been established for, decades and decades ago. And from 1982, airlines had the full freedom to set their fares. So, airlines started to abandon less profitable routes, these larger airlines, and it really became a no-holds-barred competition for passenger business and new routes. And, it certainly didn't help Pan Am. Like I said, it went defunct in 1991. If you remember the, getting ahead of myself here. Okay. Yeah, I did the thing again. Pan Am went defunct in 1991. There was also the Lockerbie bombing. That was on a Pan Am aircraft. That's certainly, all this was not like a good time to have this, like, the problems like that. So it was to be recognized, or at least associated with, a terrorist act. I know they weren't actively involved, but even so, this was a challenging time for airlines like Pan Am and other ones like U.S. Air. Pittsburgh Airport was supposed to be the new hub for U.S. Air, and eventually TWA and in St. Louis, with going, airlines like that not being able to survive because all these smaller airlines, like I said, Southwest, and then there was ValueJet. I'm trying to think of that, and I know that had its own problems. Like, what are I feel like there's so many small airlines now and budget ones that can't even think of what they're called. In any case, so this Deregulation Act really just opened up the market for any airlines who were on to come in. There was this real scramble for passengers. Of course, this has an effect on what we get or don't get today. All these amenities, except if you're, flying in first class, which I don't often do unless I pay like a little bit more to fly like a 1 hour, flight. They have like one first class ticket where, it doesn't feel like it's even a benefit. But passengers, of course, have had to give up, many things, but in terms of, more flight options and ultimately, fewer amenities, but still being able to fly and then actually being able to open up flying to even more people. So I mentioned the Concorde specifically because when there was this actually the only fatal Concorde crash when it occurred on July 25th, 2000, it really signaled just the end of this quest for speed. Martin Wollicott wrote an excellent article in The Guardian after this crash, and he talked a lot about this, where the crash of this aircraft, it hit some debris on the runway, and this eventually caused a rupture to the one of the fuel tanks, and of course it didn't get far off the ground. It was only a couple seconds after it lifted off. This signaled the end for this quest to go faster and farther. And this era of like jet setting, or even having this luxury form of travel only available to an elite few. The fatal crash of the Concorde, this particular Concorde really signified the end of that. It had taken off from Charles de Gaulle Airport, and I mentioned Gonesse earlier. It actually came down in that area, so this was the second sort of, I guess, significant event they had experienced with regards to a crash. But like I said, this really just signaled the end of it. It was a difficult plane to keep flying anyway, because it was extremely expensive with the astronomical cost of fuel. And, British Airways and Air France were the only two operators that used Concorde. But, it was more of a thing about prestige and what it mattered, or how it mattered to be able to fly on one of these planes, because you weren't carrying a whole lot of passengers. And, of course, like I said, using this amount of fuel was extremely expensive. So this, along with, of course, two other things we're very familiar with, 9/11, with increased security at airports, with, of course, like TSA, and also COVID, how this had changed flying so much from what it originally had been in the first decades of the 20th century. And I think with that, we will just go ahead and go a little bit forward, and I will just speed up and I'll go right to the thank you page. So thank you. No, that's all right.
All right, so we want questions from the audience?
Yes, yeah, we'll go ahead
okay,
and move on.
questions for Greg Seltzer on the birth of aviation, civil aviation. Don't be shy. Oh, yep, Jerry.
Not a question really, but a comment. You said the crash of the Concorde signified the end of the quest for speed. I assume you're aware that there's a company headquartered in Greensboro that is developing, supposedly, another supersonic aircraft.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say, in terms of like thinking about going faster like that, I have to say I am aware of that company in Greensboro. I don't know a whole lot about it. I would think just at a level like the quest for speed in terms of, having it just like it being so important for the public, I think, because people are fascinated with a Concorde that I think would be, I don't know, difficult to recapture with another aircraft, even if it was able to go supersonic. I think that's where my line of thinking is.
Yes, question here, Brent.
You talked about when the early airplanes were developed, they mainly carried mail and commercial cargo, and then people started flying and people started riding in them. Were those people riding in them? They were obviously rich.
Yeah.
Were they mainly riding to get from point A to point B, or was it more like a thrill ride?
I think it was. I would have to say I think there was. It's hard to say. I think there was a mix, but I think it was more of just an experience being able to do it. So more of a in the line of a thrill ride, I would say. Yeah, that would be my thinking because there weren't really. I mean, there were developed mail routes, but before actually having designated passenger aircraft, I wouldn't think it was really like a practical means of like, what are my options from getting to here to here? I mean, I can't speak for every individual person who was doing it, but I think it was more about like the experience of being able to say that you've done it, especially in these early days.
Greg, I'm wondering if you could speak to this. Something that seems interesting is that along with the development of the internet, we have the opportunity to not have to travel as much, right? It's possible to do commerce like that. And yet it seems like that travel has just continued to increase even in the era of the internet. What is the relationship between the need for people to be on these planes for work, to feel like now we feel like people are almost sort of captured by the airline industry? You're sitting on the runway for hours and you can't. So is there a sense of where is the relationship between people who are laborers and or doing international business and the desire to still be in front of somebody person to person? I mean, is the airline industry affected at all? I mean, it seems like COVID got us all able to work from home at times and whatnot. What is the relationship between labor and the need to travel?
That's a good question. And I think, I think of how busy like airlines, people still traveling so much. And I don't know if there's still to a certain extent any sort of like rebound effect from COVID for not being able to do that for an extended amount of time or being able to do that in a very limited way. Yeah, in terms of people not having to like actually be face to face or in person, yeah, that's a really good point. I don't exactly know how that like dynamic would work, because certain companies, of course, are forcing people to come back to the office anyway. It's either like come back or even if they've gone back on promises they've made. Yeah, that's.
Let me rephrase that because currently we see these. It feels like crisis, right? When people talk about air travel, maybe we only hear the bad stories. But we hear about luggage delays, the extra costs going up. What is it is it just fuel prices? What is it that's putting the airlines in crisis right now? Or it feels like, or is it just not a crisis and we only get bad anecdotes?
I mean, of course, typically bad news is a thing that sells. But, actually it was just a couple days ago, I saw, I can't remember if it was United. One airline had like all their like, everything like shut down with like their digital and like their communications. So, it's funny because technologically, the developments have made like booking flying easier, but this isn't the first time like the whole travel grid has been shut down for an airline because of a technical issue. And I don't know if it's just, if airlines are still just trying to, there's certain like profit and interest there. Yeah, I'm not really sure because it seems like they're just trying to squeeze more out of people. And yeah, I'd say I don't know all the economics of what's motivating airlines. I don't know. Part of it's just because they can. I don't know.
It feels like more and more people are traveling and that you hit a certain point where it just can't be comfortable because a storm in one place is just going to disrupt the whole system. And if more and more people are traveling, it's just
and people
inevitable.
Expect it now. You go to plane, if you fly through Atlanta, you're like, it's going to be a nightmare, I mean, people just don't expect it to go well anymore. I don't know if we've just gotten used to that or it's just funny now how, you go to the airport, you get like, popcorn and a drink and it's like $40, I don't know if people just get used to that because there's no other option.
Do we have further questions for Dr. Seltzer? Let's put our hands together for Greg Seltzer. We're going to bring our two panelists up and have them give us about 2 minutes to get us set up. We're going to have 2 chairs right here, and we'll put both of you right here. We'll have you answer questions from our audience and a panel discussion.